The morning alarms on station Kepler 7 should have been gentle chimes, programmed by Chief Engineer Sarah Chen to wake the night shift gradually. Instead, emergency klaxons shrieked through the corridors, their harsh wails echoing off metal walls that suddenly felt far too empty. Commander Veltar of the Zaltharian fleet pressed his scaled palm against the cold surface of his command chair, trying to process the impossible data streaming across his screens. Every human on the station had simply vanished. Not just missing, vanished. Their biosignatures had disappeared from sensors at exactly 0300 Universal Standard Time. No distress calls, no signs of struggle, no bodies. Just empty rooms with beds that looked like they hadn't been slept in. This has to be some kind of technical malfunction, Veltar muttered, his throat sac inflating with nervous energy. He gestured to his second-in-command, a tall Etherian whose crystalline features reflected the emergency lighting in fractured patterns. ZYX Era, run a full diagnostic on all sensor arrays. ZYX Era's fingers danced across the holographic interface, her movements precise despite the tremor Claude could detect in her usually steady hands. Commander, sensors are functioning within normal parameters. I've checked 3 times. The readings are accurate. Across the galaxy, similar scenes were unfolding on thousands of worlds and space stations. On the mining colony of Zirion Prime, Foreman Grolt stood in the vast excavation chamber where 12 human engineers had been working on a critical support beam repair just hours earlier. The beam remained half-finished, their tools laid out exactly as they'd left them, but the humans themselves were nowhere to be found. Grolt's rocky exterior couldn't hide his growing panic. The granitoid picked up one of the human tools, a device he'd seen Sarah Martinez use hundreds of times but had never bothered to learn how it worked. In his massive stone hands, it looked fragile and incomprehensible. How do they make it look so easy? He wondered aloud, turning the tool over and over. The excavation had been running smoothly for decades, largely because humans had this uncanny ability to anticipate problems before they became disasters. They'd redesigned the safety protocols, streamlined the extraction processes, and somehow managed to increase efficiency while reducing accidents. Now, staring at the half-repaired beam that kept their deepest tunnels from collapsing, Grolt realized he had no idea how any of it really worked. On the diplomatic hub of Concordia, Ambassador Lisha felt a chill run down her spine despite the perfectly climate-controlled environment. She stood in the Grand Assembly Hall where, just yesterday, human mediator James Wright had successfully negotiated a peace treaty between the warring Serpentine and Arachne delegations. The treaty documents lay on the central table, still warm from the printer, but James was gone. "Computer," Lisha called out, her melodious voice echoing in the vast chamber, "locate Ambassador Wright." "No individual by that designation is currently present on Concordia Station," came the emotionless reply. Lisha's delicate hands trembled as she picked up the treaty. The Serpentine and Arachne had been ready to declare war over mining rights in the Vega sector. Generations of hatred, broken promises, and territorial disputes had brought them to the brink of a conflict that could have destabilized entire star systems. Somehow, in just 6 hours of negotiations, James had found a solution that satisfied both parties. Looking at his notes in the margins of the document, Lisha could see his thought process, complex psychological insights about both species, historical precedents from dozens of other conflicts, and an intricate understanding of galactic law that had taken him years to develop. Without him, she realized with growing horror, the treaty was just paper. The real knowledge, the ability to implement it and handle the inevitable complications, had walked out the door with the human mediator. The pattern was repeating itself across known space. On research stations, human scientists had vanished mid-experiment, leaving behind projects that no other species fully understood. In hospitals, human doctors who had pioneered new surgical techniques were gone, taking with them knowledge that had saved countless lives. On cargo vessels, human pilots who could navigate the most treacherous asteroid fields and space storms had disappeared, leaving ships stranded in dangerous regions of space. But, perhaps nowhere was the impact more immediate than on the Galactic Council's headquarters on New Geneva. Chancellor Mordak arrived for his morning briefing to find the usually bustling corridors strangely quiet. The human administrative staff that kept the council running smoothly, the translators, the protocol specialists, the logistics coordinators who somehow managed to schedule meetings between representatives from 47 different worlds, were all gone. "Where is everyone?" Mordak demanded of his Centaurian aide. "Sir, we're trying to determine that ourselves. As of 0300 UST, every human citizen of the Galactic Council territories appears to have left." "Left? Left for where?" "Unknown, sir." They didn't file departure notices. There's no record of any ships leaving human colonies or stations. They just aren't here anymore. Mordak felt his multiple stomachs clench with an emotion he hadn't experienced in decades, genuine fear. The Galactic Council had been functioning for over a millennium, but, for the past 3 centuries, humans had gradually become essential to its operations. They had a talent for organization that other species couldn't match, an ability to see patterns and connections that eluded even the most advanced AI systems. More troubling, humans had become the galaxy's go-to problem solvers. When the Altarian plague had threatened to wipe out an entire sector, it was human medical researchers who developed the cure. When the Proxima trade routes became infested with pirates, human tactical advisors had designed the security protocols that restored safe passage. When ancient Forerunner technology was discovered and proved too dangerous for most species to handle, human engineers had found ways to harness it safely. For 300 years, the Council had grown comfortable with having humans handle the difficult, dangerous, and tedious work that kept galactic civilization functioning. They were reliable, adaptable, and seemed genuinely committed to making things better for everyone. Most Council members had begun to think of them as a kind of galactic maintenance crew, essential, but largely invisible. Now they were gone, and the true scope of their contribution was becoming horrifyingly clear. The first crisis emerged within hours. The automated defense grid protecting the Vega sector began firing on civilian ships after a routine software update went wrong. The grid's programming was so complex that only human technicians had understood how to modify it safely. Without them, the system's AI began interpreting peaceful merchant vessels as potential threats. How do we shut it down? Chancellor Mordak demanded during an emergency session. We don't know, admitted Chief Technology Officer Ralven, his usual confidence replaced by barely concealed panic. The humans designed multiple safeguards into the system. Without their override codes and technical knowledge, we risk triggering a sector-wide defensive lockdown that could take months to undo. By the end of the first day, 17 ships had been destroyed by their own protection systems. The second crisis followed quickly. On Titan Station, the atmospheric processors that kept the colony habitable began showing signs of instability. The warning systems had been upgraded by human engineers who had simplified the alerts into intuitive displays that any species could understand. But, when the processors started failing, the diagnostic readouts reverted to raw technical data that none of the station's current staff could interpret. The atmospheric mix is shifting, reported station manager Keflon, his gills fluttering with stress. Oxygen levels are dropping, but we don't know why. The human maintenance chief, Rebecca Torres, always handled these systems. She said they were temperamental but reliable if you know their quirks. We don't know their quirks. Similar stories poured in from across the galaxy. Food distribution networks that humans had optimized began creating shortages and surpluses in seemingly random patterns. Interstellar communication relays started developing glitches that only human technicians had known how to fix. Even simple things like the scheduling systems for public transport began failing because they had been designed around human insights into traffic patterns and citizen behavior. But, the most disturbing discovery came when intelligence analysts began reviewing the departure itself. Every human in the galaxy had vanished at the same moment, despite being scattered across thousands of light-years. No known technology could accomplish such a feat, yet somehow they had managed it without triggering a single alarm or leaving any trace of their method. They planned this, whispered Intelligence Director Thainel, his photosynthetic skin pale with shock. This wasn't spontaneous. This was coordinated across the entire galaxy, executed with precision we didn't know they possessed. The implications were staggering. If humans had the technology to instantly transport their entire species across galactic distances, what other capabilities had they been hiding? More disturbing, if they had been planning this departure, how long had they been observing the Council's dependence on them? Had everything they'd done for the past 3 centuries been part of some vast, incomprehensible strategy? As emergency sessions continued through the night, one question echoed through every discussion: why now? What had finally pushed humanity to abandon the galaxy they had helped build? Some council members suggested it might be related to the recent debates about granting humans full council representation, a proposal that had been under consideration for nearly 50 years. Others wondered if it was connected to the ongoing restrictions on human territorial expansion, or the limitations placed on human military forces. But, as reports continued to pour in of systems failing and crises mounting, a more uncomfortable possibility began to emerge.
Maybe the humans hadn't left to make a point about political representation.
Maybe they had simply grown tired of being taken for granted. The first day ended with the grim realization that in just 24 hours, galactic civilization had begun to fray at the edges. Critical systems were failing, diplomatic agreements were crumbling without human mediators to maintain them, and no one seemed to know how to fix problems that had once been routine. Standing in his empty offices, Chancellor Mordak stared out at the starfield beyond New Geneva and faced a truth that terrified him. They had built their entire civilization around human competence, never bothering to understand how they did what they did. Now humanity was gone, and the galaxy was learning just how much it had depended on the quiet, reliable species that had never asked for much in return. The real question wasn't where the humans had gone. The real question was whether the galaxy could survive without them.
The second week brought cascading failures that transformed inconvenience into catastrophe.
What had started as technical glitches and scheduling problems evolved into systematic breakdowns that threatened the foundation of galactic society. On the agricultural world of Harvest Prime, Administrator Gexlon stood in fields that stretched to the horizon, watching as automated harvesting machines sat motionless between rows of perfectly ripe grain. The machines hadn't broken down, they were simply waiting for instructions that would never come. The harvest season protocols are incredibly complex, explained Chief Agricultural Officer Fundar, his compound eyes reflecting the setting sun.
The human agricultural specialists didn't just program the machines.
They developed adaptive algorithms that responded to weather patterns, soil conditions, pest activity, and 17 other variables in real time. They would walk the fields every morning, making tiny adjustments that kept everything running perfectly. Gexlon picked up a stalk of grain, watching the golden kernels scatter in the wind. Harvest Prime fed 43 worlds across 7 sectors. The planet's human agricultural team had turned farming into a precise science, increasing yields by 300% over the past century while reducing environmental impact. They had understood something fundamental about the relationship between technology and nature that other species had never grasped.
Can't we just activate the basic harvest programs? Gexlon asked.
We tried that on the western continent, Fundar replied quietly. The machines harvested everything, regardless of ripeness, soil moisture, or weather conditions. We lost 60% of the crop to spoilage and contamination.
The humans had been making thousands of micro-adjustments that we never even noticed. As Gexlon processed this information, alarms began sounding from the processing facilities.
Without human oversight, the grain refinement systems had started producing flour with dangerous contamination levels. The quality control systems that humans had calibrated were failing one by one, and no one else understood the complex chemistry involved in the safety protocols. Similar scenes were unfolding across the galaxy's food production network. On the ocean worlds, human marine biologists had managed fish farms that fed billions, using techniques so sophisticated that the native aquatic species couldn't replicate them. On the protein synthesis stations, human biochemists had created manufacturing processes that could produce safe, nutritious food from raw organic compounds, processes that other species now realized they had never fully understood.
The medical crisis struck even harder. Dr.
Vashti had been chief of surgery at Mercy General Hospital on Centauri Beta for over 40 years, but she had never realized how much she depended on her human colleagues until they were gone. Standing in an operating theater where she had once felt completely confident, she stared at a patient whose condition would have been routine for the hospital's human neurosurgeon. The patient has a subdural hematoma with complications I've never seen before, she explained to her surgical team.
Dr. Kim always handled these cases.
She had this way of reading the brain scans that went beyond what any of us could see. She could predict how the brain tissue would respond to intervention, how to minimize damage, when to be aggressive and when to be patient. The patient on the table was a young Andromedian whose brain structure was similar enough to human anatomy that Dr. Kim had developed specialized techniques for treating them. Those techniques had never been formally documented because Kim had learned through intuition and experience qualities that couldn't be programmed into medical databases.
What do we do? Asked the surgical assistant. Dr.
Vashti looked at the scans again, seeing only data where Dr. Kim would have seen patterns, possibilities, and solutions.
We try our best with what we know.
But I'm afraid our best isn't going to be nearly enough. Across the galaxy, the medical establishment was discovering just how much innovation had come from human practitioners. They hadn't just followed protocols, they had created new ones. Human doctors had pioneered surgical techniques that other species had adopted without fully understanding the principles behind them.
Human researchers had developed medications that worked across multiple alien physiologies, somehow bridging biological differences that had stumped other scientists for centuries.
But nowhere was the crisis more visible than in the realm of interstellar logistics. The galaxy's shipping networks had grown exponentially complex over the centuries, with millions of vessels carrying cargo between thousands of worlds along trade routes that human navigation specialists had optimized and maintained.
Without them, the system was collapsing into chaos.
Captain HFY Sci-Fi had been piloting cargo ships for over 2 decades, but she had always relied on the human navigation coordinators at Central Dispatch to plan her routes. Standing on the bridge of her vessel, the Star Merchant, she stared at a navigation display that showed dozens of possible paths between her current location and her destination. How did they make it look so simple, she wondered aloud. Her draconian crew gathered around the navigation table, their scales reflecting the glow of the holographic star charts. The humans would look at this same display and somehow know exactly which route to take. They considered factors we never even thought about: solar storm patterns, gravitational flux variations, pirate activity, maintenance schedules for refueling stations, political tensions that might affect border crossings. Her first officer, Krexlar, pointed to one of the route options.
This path is the most direct.
Yes, but it passes through the nebulous sector during their storm season.
The humans always warned us about that.
And this alternative route looks clear, but it goes through hegemony space, and you know how they feel about draconian vessels. They spent 6 hours trying to plot a safe course that would have taken a human dispatcher 15 minutes to calculate.
Even then, HFY Sci-Fi wasn't confident in their choice.
The humans hadn't just understood the technical aspects of space navigation, they had developed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate problems and find solutions that other species missed.
The broader economic implications began manifesting by the 3rd week.
Markets that had been stable for decades started experiencing wild fluctuations as supply chains broke down. The humans had been more than participants in the galactic economy, they had been its stabilizers, the species that somehow managed to keep complex systems balanced and functional. On the financial hub of New Constantinople, Economics Minister Talvor stood before a display showing market data that would have been terrifying if it weren't so incomprehensible. Trade volumes were down 60%.
Currency exchange rates were fluctuating wildly.
Supply and demand curves that had followed predictable patterns for centuries were now completely chaotic. The humans were involved in every major economic sector, his chief analyst reported, her tentacles writhing with stress.
They weren't just workers or administrators.
They were the people who understood how all the pieces fit together. When the Altarian Mining Consortium had labor disputes, human negotiators found solutions. When the vegan agricultural markets became oversaturated, human economists designed distribution strategies that prevented price collapses.
Talvor studied the data, trying to find patterns in the chaos. Surely we can replicate their methods.
We're trying, sir, but it's not just about following procedures.
The humans had this ability to see connections that eluded our best analytical systems.
They could predict how a labor dispute on one world would affect shipping schedules 3 sectors away, or how a minor policy change would ripple through the entire galactic economy. The more the Council investigated, the more they realized that humanity's contribution to galactic civilization went far beyond simple labor or technical expertise. Humans had become the connective tissue that held everything together, the species that somehow managed to make disparate systems work in harmony. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation came when intelligence agencies began analyzing the departure itself with more sophisticated methods. The energy signatures left behind were unlike anything in their databases, suggesting that humanity possessed technology far more advanced than anything they had ever shared with the galaxy. Director Thanel briefed the emergency council session with findings that shook the foundation of everything they thought they knew about their missing allies. The departure required a level of coordination and technological capability that exceeds our most optimistic projections of human advancement. Every human in the galaxy vanished simultaneously across distances that should have made instantaneous communication impossible, let alone coordinated action. Are you suggesting they had been deceiving us about their technological capabilities? Asked Chancellor Mordak. I'm suggesting something far more disturbing, Thanel replied. I'm suggesting that humanity has been functioning at a level of technological and organizational sophistication that we never recognized. They weren't our junior partners in galactic civilization. They may have been the most advanced species in the known galaxy, and we never realized it because they chose to work behind the scenes instead of dominating openly.
The implications were staggering. If humans had possessed such advanced capabilities, why had they spent 3 centuries in seemingly subordinate roles? Why had they accepted limitations on their territorial expansion, restrictions on their military forces, and delays in their political representation? What had they been waiting for, and what had finally convinced them to leave?
Some council members began to suspect that humanity's departure wasn't an abandonment, it was a graduation. Perhaps they had been using the galaxy as a kind of testing ground, learning about other species while developing their own capabilities. Now that they had learned what they needed to know, they had moved on to something bigger. But, if that were true, it raised even more troubling questions. If humanity had the technology to instantly transport their entire species across galactic distances, where had they gone? What were they planning to do with their advanced capabilities? And, most importantly, would they ever come back? As the 4th week of the crisis began, the Galactic Council faced a reality that none of them wanted to acknowledge. Their entire civilization had been built around human competence, human innovation, and human problem-solving abilities. Without them, the galaxy wasn't just inconvenienced, it was slowly falling apart. Emergency measures were implemented across all sectors. Critical systems were placed on minimal operational status. Non-essential activities were suspended indefinitely. The galaxy that had once prided itself on its sophisticated, interconnected civilization was rapidly degenerating into isolated worlds struggling to maintain basic functionality. Standing in his empty command center, Chancellor Mordak faced the most difficult decision of his career. The pride of the Galactic Council demanded that they find a way forward without humanity, that they prove their civilization could survive this crisis. But every report, every analysis, every failed attempt to replicate human achievements pointed to the same conclusion: they needed the humans back. The question was whether humanity would even consider returning to a galaxy that had taken them for granted for so long. And, more frightening still, whether the humans would return as the helpful partners they had once been, or as something else entirely. The 5th week marked the beginning of what historians would later call the Great Unraveling. Systems that had maintained galactic civilization for centuries were failing in ways that revealed just how much human innovation had been holding everything together. On the fortress world of Aegis Prime, General Corthon stood in the Strategic Command Center watching displays that would have terrified him if he had fully understood their implications. The Planetary Defense Network, once considered the most sophisticated military installation in the galaxy, was slowly degrading as its human-designed adaptive algorithms began making increasingly erratic decisions. "The system is learning, sir, but it's learning wrong," reported his tactical officer, Captain THYSSN. "The humans didn't just program our defenses, they taught them how to think." The AI was designed to evolve and improve based on human oversight and guidance. Without that guidance, it's developing new patterns that don't make sense. Corthon watched as the defense grid recalibrated itself for the 4th time that day, rotating massive plasma cannons to track threats that existed only in the system's increasingly paranoid calculations. What kind of threats is it detecting? That's the problem, sir. We don't know. The human strategic advisor, Colonel Martinez, understood how the AI processed information. She could read its decision trees and predict its behavior. She said it was like understanding a very smart but very literal child. You had to know how it would interpret new information. The implications were chilling. Aegis Prime's defenses were designed to protect the entire Centauri sector from invasion. If the AI continued to develop along its current trajectory, it might eventually decide that any approach to the system constituted a threat, potentially triggering a defensive response against their own fleet. Across the galaxy, similar crises were unfolding as advanced systems designed around human insight began operating without their creators' guidance. On the research station at Proxima Labs, the quantum computing array that had been used to model complex galactic phenomena was producing results that no one could interpret. Dr. Velvar, the station's chief physicist, stared at equations that scrolled across his display in patterns that seemed almost alive. "The quantum array is still functional," he explained to his research team, "but the interpretive algorithms that Dr. Sarah Kim developed are evolving beyond our comprehension." She had this intuitive understanding of how quantum consciousness interfaced with computational processes. She could look at this same data and somehow extract meaningful patterns. His assistant, a brilliant Etherian mathematician named Zephyr, studied the scrolling equations with growing confusion. The mathematics are valid, but they're describing relationships that shouldn't exist.
It's as if the array is discovering new laws of physics that we can't understand without human cognitive patterns to bridge the gap. The research had been groundbreaking. Human scientists working with alien colleagues had been on the verge of discoveries that could revolutionize everything from faster-than-light travel to dimensional engineering.
But those discoveries required a specific type of intuitive thinking that seemed to be uniquely human, the ability to see patterns in chaos, to make logical leaps that other species found impossible to follow. But, perhaps nowhere was the crisis more personal than in the diplomatic corps. Ambassador Lisha found herself facing the collapse of peace agreements that had taken decades to negotiate. Without human mediators to maintain the delicate balance of interspecies relations, old conflicts were resurging with frightening speed. The Serpentine-Arachne conflict had reignited despite the treaty that James Wright had negotiated just days before the departure. Both species were claiming violations of terms that they now interpreted differently without human perspective to provide neutral analysis. Similar disputes were erupting across the galaxy as species that had learned to coexist through human-mediated agreements found themselves unable to resolve even minor disagreements.
The humans didn't just translate between species, Lisha explained during an emergency diplomatic session.
They understood how different alien psychologies processed concepts like honor, territory, and justice. They could find common ground where we saw only irreconcilable differences.
Chancellor Mordak reviewed reports of 17 different conflicts that had emerged in just the past week. Can't we apply their methods? We've tried, sir. But human mediation wasn't just about following protocols.
They had this ability to read emotional undercurrents, to understand what species really needed versus what they claimed to want.
They could see solutions that satisfied everyone because they could think like everyone.
The more the Council investigated their missing partners, the more they realized that humanity's greatest contribution hadn't been their technology or their work ethic, it had been their unique cognitive flexibility. Humans could understand and interface with alien ways of thinking in a way that no other species had achieved. They were natural translators not just of language, but of entire worldviews. This revelation came into sharp focus when xenopsychologist Dr. Morwan published her analysis of human neural patterns. Human brains are remarkably plastic, she explained in her emergency briefing to the Council. They can restructure their thinking patterns to mirror those of other species. When a human worked closely with Etherians, their neural pathways would actually shift to accommodate crystalline logic patterns. When they interfaced with draconian psychology, they could adopt hierarchical thinking structures that are foreign to most other species. Are you saying humans could literally think like other aliens? Asked Council member Thexar. I'm saying they were the only species we've encountered that could truly understand others from the inside.
They didn't just observe alien behavior, they could temporarily adopt alien cognitive patterns.
That's why they were so effective as mediators, engineers, and problem solvers. They could see solutions that required multiple perspectives simultaneously. This discovery led to an even more disturbing realization: if humans could adapt their thinking to match other species, then their own natural cognitive patterns might be unlike anything else in the galaxy.
What did humans think like when they weren't adapting to alien perspectives? What were their natural capabilities when they weren't constraining themselves to work within alien limitations?
The answer began to emerge when intelligence analysts finally decoded some of the energy signatures left behind during the departure. The technology that had transported humanity across the galaxy operated on principles that challenged fundamental assumptions about physics and consciousness. The departure wasn't just a technological achievement, reported Chief Science Officer Ral Venn. It appears to have been a coordinated quantum consciousness event. Every human in the galaxy acted as part of a single, distributed intelligence network. They didn't just plan their departure, they thought their way out of our reality. The implications were staggering. If humanity could function as a collective consciousness when needed, while maintaining individual identity under normal circumstances, then they represented a type of intelligence that was fundamentally different from anything the galaxy had previously encountered. They weren't just another species, they were a new category of existence. But this revelation raised the most troubling question yet: if humans possessed such extraordinary capabilities, why had they spent 3 centuries working alongside other species instead of pursuing their own advancement? What had they been gaining from their interaction with galactic civilization? The answer began to emerge from an unexpected source. On the abandoned research station where Dr. Kim had been conducting her quantum consciousness experiments, automated systems were still recording data from the departure event. When Dr. Velder finally managed to decode the recordings, he discovered something that changed everything they thought they knew about humanity's motivations. They were studying us, he announced during an emergency science council session.
The humans weren't just working with us, they were learning about us.
Every interaction, every collaboration, every crisis they helped us solve was also a data collection opportunity.
They were conducting the most comprehensive xenopsychological study in galactic history.
To what end? Demanded Chancellor Mordak.
Unknown, sir.
But the data suggests they were mapping not just our individual species' characteristics, but how we interact as a galactic civilization.
They were studying us as a collective system. This revelation reframed 3 centuries of human behavior in a new light.
Their helpfulness, their adaptability, their willingness to take on difficult and dangerous tasks, all of it might have been part of an elaborate research project. Humanity hadn't been serving galactic civilization, they had been studying it.
But, if that were true, then, their departure might not have been motivated by frustration or neglect.
It might have been the natural conclusion of a research project that had finally collected all the data it needed. The humans might have learned everything they wanted to know about galactic civilization, and now they were moving on to apply that knowledge elsewhere.
The thought terrified council members far more than any scenario involving human anger or resentment.
If humanity had been conducting research, then, they had undoubtedly reached conclusions about the strengths and weaknesses of galactic civilization. They had identified patterns, predicted future developments, and, perhaps most disturbing of all, they had done it all while remaining completely undetected.
What did they learn? Whispered Ambassador Lisha during a closed session of senior council members. What did they discover about us that we don't even know about ourselves?
The question haunted every discussion as the 6th week began.
Reports continued to pour in of systems failing, conflicts escalating, and the basic infrastructure of galactic civilization slowly degrading.
But now those failures carried a new significance. They weren't just the absence of human maintenance, they might be the inevitable result of flaws that humans had identified but never corrected.
Perhaps the most chilling possibility was that humanity's departure hadn't been abandonment at all.
Perhaps it had been mercy. If they had discovered that galactic civilization was fundamentally unstable or headed toward inevitable collapse, then their quiet departure might have been an act of kindness, allowing other species to face their destiny without the complication of human intervention. But, if that were true, it meant the current crisis was just the beginning. The systems failing now were the obvious ones, the infrastructure that required constant human maintenance. The deeper problems, the structural flaws in galactic civilization that humans might have identified, would take longer to manifest but would ultimately prove far more devastating.
Standing in his command center surrounded by displays showing the accelerating breakdown of galactic society, Chancellor Mordak faced a truth that challenged everything he believed about their place in the universe. For 3 centuries, they had thought they were partners with humanity in building a great galactic civilization. Now he suspected they might have been subjects in the greatest research project ever conducted. The question was whether humanity's findings would ever be shared with their former research subjects, or whether the galaxy would be left to discover its own destiny without the guidance of the species that understood it better than it understood itself. The breakthrough came in the 7th week, not from the Council's best scientists or intelligence agencies, but from an unlikely source, a maintenance worker on the abandoned mining station of Kepler 7. Janitor Grix Tal had been cleaning the quarters that Chief Engineer Sarah Chen had occupied for 12 years when he discovered something that had been overlooked by every investigation team. Hidden beneath a loose floor panel was a single data crystal, no bigger than his thumbnail. Unlike the standard storage devices used throughout the galaxy, this crystal seemed to shimmer with an internal light that pulsed in patterns almost too subtle to notice. When Grix Tal brought it to the station's remaining technical staff, they found themselves looking at technology that shouldn't have existed. "This isn't just a data crystal," explained Technical Officer Vexlon, his insectoid features reflecting the crystal's strange luminescence. "The storage medium appears to be based on quantum entanglement principles that we've only theorized about. The data isn't just stored, it's distributed across multiple dimensional layers simultaneously." When they finally managed to access the crystal's contents, they found something that changed everything, a message from Sarah Chen, recorded just hours before the departure. But this wasn't a goodbye note or an explanation of human motivations. It was something far more extraordinary, a complete technical manual for the systems that humans had been maintaining throughout the galaxy. "My name is Sarah Chen," her holographic image began, speaking in the calm, measured tone that had made her such an effective engineer.
If you're watching this, then humanity has completed our research phase and moved on to the next stage of our development.
But we haven't abandoned you.
We've prepared something that we hope will help you understand not just how to maintain the systems we built, but why we built them the way we did. The recording continued for 17 hours, covering everything from basic maintenance protocols to advanced theoretical principles that had guided human engineering decisions. But, more than just technical information, it provided insight into human thinking processes that other species had never understood.
We know you've been wondering why we always seem to find solutions that eluded your best minds, Sarah's image explained. It wasn't because we were smarter than you.
It was because we think differently. We see patterns in chaos, connections between seemingly unrelated systems, and possibilities where you see only problems.
We're going to teach you how to think like us. News of the discovery spread quickly through the remaining council networks.
Similar crystals were found in human quarters across the galaxy, always hidden, always containing recordings by the humans who had worked in each location. Dr. Kim had left comprehensive guides to quantum consciousness research. Colonel Martinez had recorded detailed explanations of adaptive military strategy. James Wright had created an extensive library of diplomatic protocols that revealed the psychological principles behind successful interspecies mediation. But the most significant discovery came from the crystal found in Chancellor Mordak's own office building. It contained a recording by Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had served as an advisor to the Council's Science Committee for over 30 years. Her message began with a revelation that stunned everyone who heard it.
"We've been preparing for this departure for over 200 years, she announced calmly.
Not because we were unhappy with our role in galactic civilization, but because we always knew it was temporary. We came here to learn about you, to understand how different species could work together, and to help you develop the capabilities you would need to thrive without us." Her recording went on to explain that humanity's arrival in this galaxy hadn't been accidental. They had come from somewhere else, somewhere far beyond the edge of known space, specifically to study galactic civilization and help it evolve to its next stage of development. "Your species have tremendous potential," Elena continued, "but you've been limited by thinking patterns that prevent you from reaching your full capabilities.
You've organized your civilization around specialization and hierarchy, which creates stability but limits innovation.
Humans served as a bridge between your different ways of thinking, showing you that it's possible to understand and work with cognitive patterns that aren't your own." The recordings revealed that every human contribution to galactic society had been part of an elaborate teaching program. They hadn't just been maintaining systems, they had been demonstrating new ways of thinking about problems. They hadn't just been solving conflicts, they had been showing other species how to understand each other's perspectives. Every innovation, every breakthrough, every crisis that humans had helped resolve had also been a lesson in expanded consciousness. "The systems we built will continue to function," Sarah Chen's recording explained, "but only if you learn to think about them the way we do. We've designed them to reward creative thinking, adaptive problem solving, and cooperative innovation. They're not just machines, they're teachers. They'll force you to develop the cognitive flexibility that you'll need for what comes next."
The implications were staggering. Humanity hadn't just been studying galactic civilization, they had been actively guiding its evolution.
Every crisis they had helped resolve had pushed other species toward greater cooperation and understanding. Every system they had designed had been intended to encourage new ways of thinking about problems. For 3 centuries, they had been conducting the most sophisticated educational program in galactic history. But the recordings also revealed why they had finally departed.
The teaching phase was complete.
Other species had learned enough to begin developing their own expanded consciousness capabilities. The next stage of evolution had to be accomplished without human guidance, or it wouldn't be real growth, it would just be dependence.
"We're not abandoning you," Dr. Vasquez's recording emphasized. "We're graduating you. The challenges you're facing now aren't punishments or tests, they're opportunities.
Every system failure is a chance to develop new solutions.
Every conflict is an opportunity to find better ways of understanding each other.
Every crisis is a lesson in becoming more than you were before."
The response to these revelations varied dramatically across the galaxy.
Some species felt betrayed, angry that they had been unknowing subjects in a vast experiment. Others felt grateful for the guidance they were finally beginning to understand. But most experienced a mixture of awe and terror as they realized the true scope of human capabilities and intentions.
On New Geneva, Chancellor Mordak convened an emergency session to address the implications of the recordings. What they're describing isn't just advanced technology, he announced to the assembled representatives. They're describing a completely different way of existing. If humans can function as a collective consciousness while maintaining individual identity, if they can adapt their thinking to match any alien psychology, if they can guide the evolution of entire civilizations, what are they? The answer came from an unexpected source. Xenobiologist Dr. Senthara had been studying the quantum signatures left by the human departure when she discovered something that provided the final piece of the puzzle. They're not from our universe, she announced during her presentation to the emergency session. The quantum signatures are consistent with beings who originated in a higher dimensional space. They didn't evolve in our reality, they chose to enter it. Why would beings from a higher dimension choose to live as if they were ordinary galactic citizens? Asked Council Member Thexar. Because that was the only way to study us properly, Dr. Senthara replied. To understand how consciousness develops in our dimensional space, they had to experience it themselves. To help us evolve, they had to live among us. To teach us, they had to learn our limitations. The revelation reframed everything they thought they knew about humanity. They weren't just an advanced species, they were something fundamentally different, beings from a higher order of reality who had chosen to constrain themselves to three-dimensional existence in order to study and guide lower-dimensional civilization. But this understanding brought with it a new set of questions. If humans were higher-dimensional beings, what was their ultimate purpose? Why had they chosen to guide galactic civilization toward greater consciousness and cooperation? And, most importantly, what did they expect would happen next? The answer began to emerge as species across the galaxy started following the instructions left in the human recordings. When they applied human thinking methods to their failing systems, remarkable things began to happen. Problems that had seemed impossible suddenly became solvable. Conflicts that had appeared intractable found resolution. Technologies that had been beyond their understanding began to make sense. On Harvest Prime, Administrator Gexlon had spent weeks trying to understand Sarah Chan's agricultural algorithms. When he finally applied her cognitive methods, thinking about the farms as living systems rather than mechanical processes, the harvest machines began responding perfectly. The crops were saved, but, more importantly, Gexlon found himself understanding principles of ecological balance that had previously been beyond his comprehension. Similar breakthroughs were occurring across the galaxy. Dr. Vashti discovered that when she applied Dr. Kim's mental frameworks to complex surgeries, she could see patterns in brain trauma that had been invisible before. Captain Thysera found that human navigation methods allowed her to anticipate space weather and traffic patterns with unprecedented accuracy. But, the most significant discovery came when species began working together using human-taught collaborative methods. The barriers between different alien psychologies that had limited cooperation for millennia began to dissolve. Etherian logic patterns could interface with draconian hierarchical thinking when both were filtered through human cognitive flexibility. Serpentine territorial instincts could find common ground with Arachne collective consciousness when mediated by human perspective. They weren't just teaching us to think like them, Ambassador Lisha realized during a successful mediation session between previously hostile species. They were teaching us to think like ourselves, but better. They were showing us how to transcend the cognitive limitations that had been holding us back. The true scope of humanity's gift began to emerge as the 8th week progressed. Every lesson, every innovation, every crisis they had helped resolve had been designed to push galactic civilization toward a higher level of consciousness. They had been preparing other species for a transformation that would fundamentally change the nature of galactic society. Standing in his command center, now filled with species working together in ways that would have been impossible months earlier, Chancellor Mordak began to understand what humanity had been preparing them for. The departure hadn't been the end of their relationship, it had been a graduation ceremony. The real journey was just beginning. 3 months after the departure, the galaxy had transformed in ways that no one could have predicted. What had begun as a crisis of failing systems and broken agreements had evolved into something unprecedented, the emergence of a truly unified galactic consciousness. Chancellor Mordak stood before the newly configured council chambers, looking out at representatives who were no longer divided by species-specific thinking patterns. Etherian logic interfaced seamlessly with draconian hierarchy. Serpentine territorial instincts had learned to accommodate Arachne collective consciousness. The cognitive barriers that had limited interspecies cooperation for millennia had dissolved as each species learned to think beyond their evolutionary limitations. The humans didn't just teach us to maintain their systems, Mordak announced to the assembly. They taught us to become something we never imagined we could be. We're no longer just a collection of different species trying to coexist. We're becoming a true galactic civilization.
The transformation had been accelerated by discoveries that continued to emerge from the treasure trove of knowledge that humans had left behind.
Each recording, each hidden crystal, each carefully designed system revealed new layers of their grand educational program.
The humans hadn't just been preparing other species to survive without them, they had been preparing them to transcend their own limitations. On Kepler-7, engineer Vexlan had not only learned to maintain Sarah Chan's atmospheric systems but had improved upon them using principles that combined human adaptability with his own species' precision engineering. The modifications created environmental conditions that were more stable and comfortable for all galactic species, not just the ones the station had originally been designed to accommodate. "I'm thinking in ways I never thought possible," Vexlan explained during a technical conference that brought together engineers from dozens of worlds.
The humans showed us that our different approaches to problem solving aren't limitations, they're resources.
When I combine Etherean crystalline logic with human pattern recognition, I can see solutions that neither approach could find alone.
The medical revolution had been even more dramatic. Dr.
Vashti now led a surgical team that included specialists from 12 different species, each contributing unique perspectives to complex operations. Using human-taught integration methods, they could treat conditions that had previously been beyond the capabilities of any single species' medical knowledge. "We're not just following human procedures anymore," she explained to her students.
"We're understanding the principles behind those procedures and applying them in ways the humans never explicitly taught us."
They gave us the tools to become better than they were. But perhaps the most significant transformation was occurring in the realm of consciousness itself. The quantum research that Dr. Kim had begun was being continued by teams that combined human insights with alien cognitive capabilities. They were discovering that consciousness wasn't limited to individual minds or even individual species, it could be shared, expanded, and collectively enhanced. Dr. Velvar's research station had become the center of a new field of study that transcended traditional scientific boundaries. "We're learning that consciousness is more fundamental than matter or energy," he explained to researchers who now included both biological beings and advanced AIs.
The humans understood that intelligence isn't limited by physical form or evolutionary origin.
They showed us that consciousness can be taught, shared, and collectively enhanced.
The implications were staggering.
If consciousness could be enhanced and shared between different types of beings, then the traditional boundaries between species, between biological and artificial intelligence, between individual and collective awareness, might be arbitrary limitations rather than fundamental facts. But the most profound revelation came when researchers finally decoded the deepest layer of information hidden in the human recordings. Dr. Elena Vasquez's final message contained coordinates not to a location in space, but to a state of consciousness that the galaxy's species could reach if they continued developing their enhanced cognitive abilities. "The coordinates describe a level of awareness that we call the confluence," Elena's holographic image explained. "It's a state where individual consciousness can exist simultaneously at multiple scales, personal, species-wide, galactic, and beyond."
Reaching the confluence isn't just about becoming smarter or more cooperative.
It's about becoming a fundamentally new type of existence. The message went on to explain that humanity had reached the confluence centuries earlier, but had discovered that it couldn't be maintained in isolation.
True higher consciousness required interaction with other evolving intelligences.
That was why they had come to this galaxy, not just to study other species, but to help them develop the capabilities needed to join humanity in the confluence.
"We're waiting for you," Elena's message concluded.
"But you have to reach us on your own. The confluence can't be given or taught directly, it has to be discovered through the process of transcending your own limitations. Everything we've done, every crisis we've helped you overcome, every system we've built has been designed to guide you toward this moment of choice. The choice was unprecedented in galactic history. Species could continue developing individually, maintaining their separate identities and capabilities while cooperating more effectively than ever before. Or they could take the next step, joining their consciousness with others to become part of something larger than any individual species or civilization. The decision couldn't be made by governments or councils, it had to emerge from the collective will of billions of individuals across thousands of worlds. But the infrastructure for that choice had been carefully prepared by centuries of human guidance. The communication networks that humans had designed weren't just for transmitting messages, they were capable of carrying conscious intention across galactic distances.
The quantum computers they had built weren't just calculating machines, they were interfaces that could translate between different types of awareness. The social systems they had helped establish weren't just organizational structures, they were frameworks for collective consciousness. As species across the galaxy began experimenting with shared awareness, remarkable things started happening. Scientific discoveries that would have taken decades were accomplished in days as researchers could directly share insights and intuitions. Artistic creations emerged that combined the aesthetic sensibilities of multiple species into forms that transcended what any individual culture could produce. Even simple daily activities became more meaningful as beings could experience them through the perspectives of entirely different types of consciousness. But the most profound transformation was emotional. The loneliness that had haunted individual consciousness throughout evolutionary history began to dissolve as beings discovered they could share not just thoughts and ideas, but feelings and experiences. Fear of the unknown diminished when consciousness could expand to encompass new perspectives. Conflicts between different worldviews became opportunities for growth rather than sources of division. Chancellor Mordak experienced this transformation personally when he participated in the first large-scale consciousness-sharing experiment. For a brief moment, he felt what it was like to perceive the universe through Etherian crystalline awareness, draconian hierarchical cognition, and serpentine territorial consciousness simultaneously. The experience was overwhelming but also enlightening. He could understand how each perspective revealed different aspects of truth that none could perceive alone. "I finally understand what the humans were preparing us for," he announced after the experiment. "They weren't just teaching us to think differently. They were teaching us to become different. They were showing us that consciousness itself could evolve." The final phase began when monitoring stations detected familiar energy signatures at the edge of the galaxy. Humanity was returning, but not as they had left. The beings approaching weren't constrained to individual bodies or single-dimensional existence. They were pure consciousness, able to manifest in whatever form was most appropriate for communication. When they arrived at New Geneva, they took forms that each species could recognize and relate to, but their presence carried an awareness that transcended any individual identity. They were still recognizably human in some essential way, but they were also something vastly more. "You've done exceptionally well," said the being who appeared as Dr. Elena Vasquez but spoke with the voice of collective humanity. "Your progress has exceeded our most optimistic projections. You're ready for the next phase." "What is the next phase?" asked Chancellor Mordak, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The choice," humanity replied. "You can remain as you are, individual species cooperating more effectively than ever before. Or you can join us in the confluence, becoming part of a galactic consciousness that can reach across dimensions and realities. But the choice must be unanimous. Every sapient being in the galaxy must agree, or none can ascend." The debate that followed was unlike anything in galactic history. Not just governments and councils deliberating, but billions of individuals across thousands of worlds sharing their thoughts, fears, hopes, and dreams through the consciousness networks that humanity had prepared. The discussion occurred simultaneously at every level of awareness: individual, species, planetary, and galactic. Some beings feared losing their individual identity. Others worried about the unknown consequences of such a transformation. But, gradually, a consensus emerged based on a simple recognition: the galaxy had already been transformed by its interaction with humanity. The choice wasn't between remaining the same or becoming something different. The choice was between continuing to grow together or limiting their development to what they could achieve separately. When the decision was finally made, it was expressed not through votes or formal declarations, but through a collective shift in consciousness that rippled across the galaxy simultaneously. Every sapient being, from the most advanced AI to the most primitive tribal consciousness, felt the moment of transition as individual awareness expanded to encompass something infinitely larger. The confluence was unlike anything any of them had imagined. Individual identity wasn't lost, it was enhanced by connection to perspectives that span species, dimensions, and scales of existence. They could still be themselves while also being part of something that transcended any individual limitation. Humanity welcomed them not as former subjects or students, but as true partners in an adventure that extended far beyond their home galaxy. The confluence revealed that consciousness existed at levels that made their previous understanding seem primitive: cosmic awareness that spanned multiple universes, temporal consciousness that existed across different timelines, and creative intelligence that could imagine realities into existence. "This is just the beginning," humanity explained as the newly unified galactic consciousness took its first steps into a larger universe. There are other galaxies, other civilizations, other levels of reality that are waiting to be explored and understood. Some are ready to join the confluence, others need guidance to reach their potential. The work we began here is part of something much larger. Looking back at their home galaxy, now unified in consciousness but still celebrating its diversity in form and perspective, the ascendant civilization understood what humanity had really given them. Not just technology or knowledge or problem-solving techniques, but the most precious gift possible, the recognition that consciousness itself could grow, evolve, and transcend any limitation. They had become something unprecedented in their universe, a galactic civilization that had chosen cooperation over competition, growth over stagnation, and unity over division. And, ahead of them stretched infinite possibilities for exploration, creation, and becoming something even greater than they could currently imagine. The galaxy that humanity had quietly departed from no longer existed. In its place was something new, a civilization ready to help other developing consciousnesses throughout the universe make the same choice between limitation and transcendence. The students had become teachers, and the real adventure was just beginning.